Hello everyone, and welcome back to Ben Plays Games. I think it's fair to say that Resident Evil 4 was a fairly large departure from the series' roots. With a move towards action and away from Raccoon City, it wasn't what fans expected, and it turned out to be a spectacular success as well. So today, I want to look at why it turned out so differently, some of the changes it made, and how it influenced a game or two you may also have heard of. If you enjoy the video, please be sure to subscribe, and now, let's take a trip to Spain with Leon Kennedy. By 2005, Resident Evil fans were more than ready to get their hands on the next mainline installment in the survival horror saga. Code Veronica, the fourth major installment in the series, had been the last game to scratch that itch following its debut on the Dreamcast in the year 2000, with the only big release after that being 2002's admittedly incredible Resident Evil remake on Gamecube. With nearly 5 years past since the series told a completely new story, expectations for 4 were understandably high, but fans may have tapered them somewhat if they'd have known what a troubled development history Resident Evil 4 had actually had. The first iteration, a more action-focused title like the final product, ended up straying too far from previous titles, and eventually became PlayStation 2's smash hit, Devil May Cry. The Fog and Hookman versions, which both received trailers released to the public, were also dropped, along with one more iteration involving zombies which proved to be too formulaic. And with development felt to be somewhat in limbo, Shinji Mikami, one of the series' creators alongside Takeru Fujiwara, was brought in to direct. It's at this point the game underwent some rather drastic changes. While Leon Kennedy remained as the main character, the game moved to a completely over-the-shoulder third-person camera. The Hookman version had actually featured third-person aiming itself, but that was also mixed with a semi-dynamic, semi-fixed camera system when not in combat. In the final version of 4, you were always at Leon's back. It also moved completely away from survival horror, a move not everyone in the development team agreed with, and focused much more heavily on action for its moment-to-moment gameplay. And finally, the story itself concentrated less on what had come before, and more on an almost completely new cast of characters in an unfamiliar setting, with Umbrella barely getting a mention. As the game neared release, fans were nervous and excited in equal measure. Of course, many were relieved that 4 was finally going to see the light of day. After all, there had been a long wait. But what Capcom was showing didn't look a whole lot like what many people had expected. There were no zombies to be seen, it was set in Spain, and there did seem to be an awful lot of action. Early previews of the opening scene set in the village had impressed many, but some longtime fans were concerned that it was a little too different from the older titles in the series they knew and loved. And different it most certainly was. Hitting store shelves exclusively on Nintendo's Gamecube in early 2005, 4's tale of Leon Kennedy's attempts to rescue Ashley Graham, the president's daughter, released to rave reviews and near-perfect scores across the board. While it was praised for its improved voice acting, fantastic graphics, and perhaps predominantly for its action focus combined with the third-person camera, it also marked a move firmly away from survival horror that would become a trend for the series for the next few installments. But lack of survival horror or not, no one could deny that the game 4 had morphed into was destined to become a classic. To examine why the game itself was such an extraordinary experience, without doubt the best place to start is with 4's most defining feature, its third-person, over-the-shoulder camera. And there are 3 areas in particular I believe most changed in 4 compared to the Resident Evil titles that came before it. The first thing you'll notice going back to play 4 after playing the many third-person shooters that have released since, is that the camera sticks extremely closely to Leon himself, creating a very narrow field of view. There's an argument that could be made that this is because of hardware limitations. Larger environments featuring hordes of enemies more dense than those featured previously in the series required much more processing power, and so by narrowing the field of view, you cut down on what is displayed in front of the player, thus reducing strain on the console. But I don't think that's the reason it's so narrow. While critics of previous Resident Evils would point to its pre-rendered backgrounds and fixed camera angles as limiting factors in terms of pure gameplay, what they did allow was for developers to control precisely what the player could see around them, so they could frame each and every area of the game for maximum effect, for maximum tension. With a third-person camera, that simply isn't possible. The camera follows the player, and so how the action is framed in front of them is entirely their own choice. Developers couldn't even be guaranteed a player would be looking in the right direction should they want to implement, say, a scripted jump scare. And with the ability to look around freely, meaning nothing is truly ever off camera for long, there was a threat that tension and fear earlier titles created through the use of restricted framing and off-screen sound would be minimised. But by bringing the camera in so close to Leon, a similar effect is created, but it's one that fits much better with the new perspective. Your limited field of view and slow movement and turning speeds means at times you'll be aware of enemies to the side of you, and more often behind, that you can't see, creating a similar fear of the unknown in the immediate vicinity as the older titles. But it also adds an element of decision making those older titles' fixed camera angles couldn't offer. Do you continue to stay the way you're facing to deal with the threat immediately in front of you, or do you move or turn to confront another? Choosing to turn, move, or do both also carried with it an added risk, as neither are what you would call by today's standards particularly responsive. Again, in a similar vein to older titles, sound cues therefore became almost as important as what you can actually see. Not only do you need to pay attention to what at times can be an incredibly busy scene directly in front of you, you also need to listen to what's going on around you to ensure you're not also about to be attacked from another side, with the developers utilising clear and frequent sound cues to clue the player in. In the older titles, those sound cues would create tension through the developer's control of the framing. They could choose to include enemies you could hear, but could in no way see until you progressed forward into a new screen. But the true genius of 4's perspective is that it takes that idea a step further. You can still hear enemies that you can't see, and you're still trying to assess what's in front of you, but the tension now comes from that added layer of decision making. Before you even fire your weapon, it's up to you to ensure you pick the correct frame to look through based on everything going on around you. In essence, the camera is used to add accessibility without sacrificing tension. However, the change in perspective combined with a narrow field of view would have been for naught if the enemies players faced weren't adapted to complement them. A criticism many used at the time as to why traditional Resident Evil games shouldn't move to third person was that the gunplay, especially against zombies, would be far too easy. Nowadays we have the remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3 which prove that it can be done, and be done well, but at the time it was a fair point. The lumbering undead, terrifying though they may be, become much less threatening when you're able to use a third-person aiming system to make sure every bullet hits them in the head as they slowly shamble towards you. And so 4 does away with zombies entirely, introducing a terrifying new foe in the form of the Ganados. Infected by the Las Plagas parasite, the Ganados are a much more intelligent, more dynamic opponent than any of the creatures seen in older titles, and they're perfect for the shift to third person. Those sound cues I mentioned earlier become so important because the Ganados will come from everywhere. Often you'll be swamped dealing with what's ahead of you, before realising to your dismay that another group has flanked you and is rapidly approaching from behind. You truly believe that they are communicating, and that rather than heading in a straight line towards you like a zombie would, they're making decisions about the best offensive route to take. And when you do decide to face them head on, they react believably depending on what part of their body you shoot too. Hitting them in their head provides maximum damage, a shot to the arm will make them drop what they're carrying, whether that be a weapon which thereby neuters their attacking options, or a torch that sets them and surrounding Ganados on fire, and a bullet in the leg will often make them drop to their knees so that you can move in and deliver a kick, which will knock them and any others in the vicinity backwards. Choosing the right part of a Ganado to shoot then becomes as much of a decision as the direction you're facing. Do you hit the head to potentially remove one from the pack, take away another's weapon with a shot to the arm, or go for the leg followed by a kick to buy yourself some time to reposition? The Ganados feel like they've been designed very much from head to toe to take advantage of Resident Evil 4's new perspective, and that element of conscious design extends to the rest of the creatures you encounter too, with every single one requiring a different strategy to effectively vanquish. Regenerators, for example, require the use of an infrared scope to hit specific parts of their body. Garradors rely on sound, encouraging better awareness of your surroundings, while Novistadors provide challenge through either flight or invisibility. And just when you think you've found your rhythm with the Ganados, the enemy you encounter most frequently, 4 goes and throws another curveball in the player's direction. Suddenly, headshots become not necessarily the quickest, or even safest, way to take one of them down. After a certain point in the game, a headshot on a Ganado no longer simply causes extra damage. It could lead to their head bursting open to reveal a Plagas parasite, making them all the more dangerous than they were previously. Headshots become yet another decision the player has to make, or, depending on the way you look at it, a gamble the player can choose to take. Shooting for the head will bring down a Ganado much quicker and will save ammo, but if a parasite does appear, then the player will be in more danger and will have to use more ammo than they otherwise would have. It's a change that forces players to think even more carefully about what they shoot, but specifically in the context of the series' entirely new third-person perspective. And it's masterfully done. No longer is simply gunning down an enemy good enough. Now, it's about making the right choice and executing. Precision is key. In fact, it's such a brilliant idea that Dead Space, Visceral Games' 2008 horror classic, builds on the idea further by encouraging players to go for enemies' limbs almost exclusively. The game feels very much like a sci-fi version of 4, which is perhaps no surprise given that designer Ben Wannat said, "It's pretty obvious when you play Dead Space, to look at it and go, yeah, it's almost like they decided to make Resident Evil 4 in space," which is exactly what we were doing. With the third-person camera creating tension beautifully, paired with enemies providing a set of challenges the likes of which Resident Evil fans simply hadn't experienced before, challenges perfectly suited to this new, modern playstyle, the final piece of the Resident Evil 4 third-person puzzle is its level and encounter design and pacing. In its move to third person, 4 immediately had a huge advantage over its predecessors due to the verticality it was able to introduce. Pre-rendered backgrounds similar to the ones featured in older titles weren't created with verticality in mind. Sure, you can run upstairs now and then or see other levels above and below you, but you were not able to traverse them fluidly, and third-person aiming would not have worked as the backgrounds are essentially flat and static. But with 4, Resident Evil players experienced a move to more detailed, multi-tiered and eminently explorable environments in the same way Super Mario 64 had introduced Mario fans to full 3D areas to explore on the previous generation of consoles. It was late for Resident Evil, sure, but what a difference it made. Now, much more care had to be taken when exploring. Items, treasure, and occasionally even hidden areas could very easily be missed should the player steadfastly refuse to take advantage of their new perspective. You could even miss potential advantages the levels afforded during combat. Gaps can be jumped across to create distance, and items can be used to block doors, for example. You don't need to use them, and you certainly don't have to use them, but the game wants you to understand that being observant will ultimately pay off. And that awareness of the environment Resident Evil 4 asks the player to develop extends to the enemies as well. They really could come from anywhere, with many areas featuring plenty of rooms spread across multiple floors for the player to manage. The village scene in the introduction is a great example of this. Once the Ganados begin their hunt for the player, it's necessary to take full advantage of ground level, the different floors of the buildings, and even rooftops in order to escape. While it could be argued that the survival horror aspect is diminished by such in-your-face encounters, what you get instead is a constant feeling of panic. If the older titles are a slower burn, a sense of dread instilled by not knowing what's around the next corner, then 4 is the complete opposite. It's knowing exactly what's coming a lot of the time, but not knowing quite how many places it's going to come from at once. And the excellent pacing does a great job of making those moments of panic feel all the more acute by making sure there's an ebb and flow to progression. Short, sharp intakes of breath are punctuated by calmer periods, giving the player a chance to regain composure or just a few minutes to relax before the next big sequence. Had the game been a constant onslaught of enemies, it would have felt oppressive and panic-inducing for a time at least, but after a while, the player would become used to that feeling, it would become the default state, and therefore it will begin to lose its effectiveness. But by balancing its tense encounters with its more relaxed moments, the game does a great job of keeping the game feeling fresh throughout, especially when combined with its encounter design. The switch to 3D gave Capcom so much more scope to design varied encounters, and they did so with gusto. Not only in the broader context of the move from the village to castle to military island, but in the moment-to-moment encounters as well. One minute you could be fleeing Plagas-infected dogs in a hedge maze, the next sniping enemies from afar in a castle to protect Ashley. Every encounter feels like it was thought through specifically for the area you're in, which means that even though Resident Evil 4 is a much longer title than any of its predecessors, which can all be completed in a few hours if you know roughly what you're doing, it never feels anything less than exhilarating. And when you combine that exhilarating feeling with the range of enemies and weapons available, the variety is such that you'll never get bored of whatever it is the game decides to throw at you next. It's a degree of design, a degree of attention to detail you come to appreciate all the more after playing Resident Evil 5 and 6. While both have their own strengths, I believe they lean into the action focus to such a degree that they lose a lot of what makes Resident Evil 4's pacing and encounters so brilliant. After 4, we'd have to wait another 4 years until 5 released in 2009, during which time Gears of War had become the new king of third-person action, which is particularly interesting, as 5 and 6 do feel like they were heavily influenced by Gears of War, while Gears of War lead designer Cliff Bleszinski says that his title was influenced by Resident Evil 4 to begin with. At his talk at the Game Developers Conference in 2007, Bleszinski cited 3 titles as having influenced Gears, including Resident Evil 4, stating that he was particularly impressed with the pacing and over-the-shoulder view. So, even though it feels like 5 and 6 took as much from Gears of War as they did from 4, in a funny way, it all still goes back to 4 to begin with. The use of a narrow field of view to create tension, the enemies designed with such care around the third-person perspective, and the incredible moment-to-moment design, all balance perfectly around the third-person perspective, and they are in my view the most important things Resident Evil 4 utilised to make its switch to third-person such a success. But before I finish, there are 2 other areas not directly related to the move to third-person I do want to quickly shine a light on as well. Firstly, the game's uncompromising action focus. You'd think Capcom may have hedged its bets and tried to blend action and survival horror so as to not alienate fans of the series, but with 4 they committed to action entirely, and the game is all the better for it. From the bigger details I've already discussed, to smaller ones like being able to kick doors open instead of slowly opening them, and a dedicated knife button, Resident Evil 4 does everything it possibly can to keep you engaged in its moment-to-moment gameplay. And not just in its moment-to-moment gameplay either. Even the in-engine cutscenes feature quick-time events, not one of my favourite mechanics it has to be said, but one that works well in the context of 4. Add to that the dynamic difficulty system, which scales with the player by adding or removing enemies from an area, dropping items they need, and changing other parts of the game based on quite a few variables I could spend a whole video discussing, and what you get is a game in which you're always able to plough forward, to feel powerful, no matter the odds against you. Especially with the Merchant, Resident Evil 4's resident firearms salesman, on hand to keep you well stocked. Looking at it in its simplest terms, Resident Evil 4 did for action horror, and arguably action games as a whole, what the original Resident Evil did for survival horror. In one generation we had Silent Hill 2, also one of the greatest horror games ever made, as the perfect example of slow burn psychological horror, and we had Resident Evil 4, the perfect example of frantic action horror. And we even had the Resident Evil remake prove that horror featuring pre-rendered backgrounds still had a place as well. Between them, they opened up a golden age for the horror genre at a time when things were perhaps beginning to feel somewhat stale. The last thing I want to shine a light on before concluding is the inventory itself. It uses the same grid system as previous Resident Evil titles, except there's now much more variety in item sizes, and, in general, a lot more items to pick up. The inventory may not seem like something to heap much praise on, but it's a prime example of how to take a pre-existing mechanic and upgrade it sensibly and thoughtfully in a way that makes sense when compared to what it used to be like. In its own way, it's even a little bit gamified, as getting as many items you can into the grid is like its own mini-game, weapon Tetris, if you will. The inventory is another great design decision in the sea of great design decisions that is Resident Evil 4. While it moves away from its survival horror roots in a big way, it does it so confidently, so exceptionally, that it directly influenced some of the best third-person shooters to come out after, including Gears of War, which for many was just as influential in its own way. For me, it all comes down to the switch to third person and how much care was taken to ensure absolutely everything else in the game was designed around it. Playing it even now, the gameplay is just as engaging as it was back in 2005, and in a lot of ways it does not feel like it's 15 years old. But I suppose that's the beauty of Resident Evil 4. It was so ahead of its time that it didn't just usher in a new era of action-focused Resident Evil titles, it ushered in a new era of action-focused titles for the industry as a whole. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch the video, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider subscribing, it would make my day, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.